The original OG Bitcoiners own less Bitcoin than you would think. Let's talk about why, because it's interesting. So, original OG Bitcoiners had two problems to deal with that you do not have to deal with. So, in some ways, be thankful that you're not an OG Bitcoiner, because life was a lot. It was a lot scarier or not scarier. It was a lot more prone to error and prone to hacker in the very early days of Bitcoin. So, two things that resulted in a lot of OG Bitcoiners having a lot less Bitcoin than you would think was exchange hacks and people losing their Bitcoin or throwing it away because it was just worth so little that it didn't matter. So this was a constant happening between 2009 and probably 2013, and was probably still happening up through 2016. So since I've bought Bitcoin starting in 2017, I don't think I've ever encountered someone from 2017 forward that lost their Bitcoin in an exchange hack, or that lost their Bitcoin because they threw away the private key. That just doesn't happen anymore. The world has changed. Technology's better. You know, the something called seed phrases was invented, which you don't have to worry about, but, you know, it made it a lot easier for techie people to keep track of their Bitcoin, even if they want to do it all themselves and all that sort of stuff. Well, none of that stuff existed in the early days of Bitcoin. And so very early on, people would go buy Bitcoin on Bitcoinica or Mt. Gox or any of these services, and there was not a good way to self-custody your Bitcoin. There was nothing like BitKey, which is by far the best way, and there were not reputable exchanges like Coinbase and River and others that were not just going to get hacked. So what happened is people had they would keep all their Bitcoin on Mt. Gox or Bitcoinica or any of these services, and then the exchange itself would have a major hack and lose a huge amount of Bitcoin. And they might own tens of thousands of Bitcoin, and poof, it would just be gone. So you don't have to worry about that now, but that used to be a big problem in the early days of Bitcoin when nobody was sure how to secure it, and the technology, Bitcoin itself was always secure, but holding those private keys of ownership was just, the early technologies to do that were not developed, they were just very early. So if you were an OG early Bitcoiner, there is a good chance that a significant amount of your Bitcoin got stolen in the Mt. Gox hack or Bitcoinica or any of the numerous other exchange hacks that happened early in Bitcoin's life. And if you didn't get hacked, there was a very good chance that you threw away the keys. Now, why is that? Well, because people are throwing away digital stuff all the time. They just delete stuff to free up hard drive space. They delete stuff that they're sure is backed up to the cloud, and then later they find out it's not backed up to the cloud. And in the early days of Bitcoin, people had 100 Bitcoin. And even when it was worth, $100, they would delete a file. They would realize, ooh, dang it, that had 100 Bitcoin. But they'd look at the price and they'd be like, well, it was only $100. It's not worth all the trouble of recovering, jumping through a bunch of hoops to recover 100 Bitcoin because it's only worth $100. So it's only worth $100. It's just not worth the trouble. So this happens all the time, most famously by a guy in the UK, somewhere in either the UK, Great Britain, something like that. Anyway, he threw away a hard drive that had a total of 7,800 Bitcoin on it, which is more than whatever, $900 million of Bitcoin. But at the time it got thrown away, it was worth about, I think, $7,000 or $8,000. And it got thrown away. He realized it after the fact. But at that point, the dump truck had, or not the dump truck, but the trash truck, the garbage truck, whatever you want to call it, the garbage truck had left. It was no longer in his neighborhood. There was no way to track it down. Now, obviously, if it was 900 million, people would have called emergency services and gone and camped out at the dump and gone through every trash truck that showed up for the next 2 weeks looking for that hard drive. But at the time, it was like $7,000. It's a big loss, but nobody's going to chase the trash truck all over the planet for $7,000 when there's no guarantee you'll ever find the trash truck that's got your Bitcoin hard drive in it. And again, so he didn't. Well, now it's worth, $800 million, literally $800 million, and he's trying to buy the entire landfill. The guy is trying to buy the entire landfill so he can go through every piece of trash in the entire landfill looking for one hard drive that has the private keys to about 8,000 Bitcoin. It's crazy. So, but stuff like that just doesn't happen anymore. Nobody throws away Bitcoin thinking, it will probably never be worth anything, or, it's $100 a coin, but, that might be the end of it. Just not sure it's going to be worth any more than that, or whatever it is. Like, just nobody does that. Or I guess back then it was like $1 a coin, because if it was 7,000 or 8,000 Bitcoin, and I think the total value back then, it was like $1 a coin or something like that. So at $1 a coin, a lot of people thought, well, it's probably topped out. I mean, how high can it go? So two things you don't have to worry about are exchange hacks. You do still have to worry about your account getting hacked, but you generally do not have to worry about the exchange itself getting hacked and losing all the Bitcoin. It still does happen, so it's not a zero risk, but it went from back then to a very high risk to the modern era, which I would characterize it as a much lower risk. But the other reason, so other than exchange hacks, which that risk has dropped to close to zero for the exchange itself. It's still relatively high for individual accounts that are not properly secured, but for exchanges themselves, that, risk has gone way down. But the other, and people just don't lose their Bitcoin anymore because there's safe ways to secure it. Nobody keeps private keys on a hard drive anymore. That's like totally 100% not a thing. And, things like BitKey have so many backup options that it's literally, as long as you have a recovery contact, which they used to call trusted contact set up, you're basically golden. But the number one reason early OG Bitcoiners don't have a ton of Bitcoin is because they sold it. Because they had it and they got it for next to nothing, and then it went up 10x in value, and they thought, hey, there's no telling what will happen with this in the long term, and they cashed out 1,000 Bitcoin and bought a house. Or they cashed out 10,000 Bitcoin and bought 2 pizzas. Laszlo Hajniak, who did it 4 times. It's either 3 or 4 times that he sold 10,000 Bitcoin in exchange for 2 Papa John's pizzas. And he was just it was the first commercial real world transaction. Nobody knew what the price of a Bitcoin was because it had never been exchanged for a real world item like 2 Papa John's pizzas, which at the time was about $40. So anybody in the world could have exchanged, $40 for 10,000 Bitcoin. And he just decided, hey, whoever will buy me 2 Papa John's pizza, I'll give 10,000 Bitcoin. Same way I give away like $30 of Bitcoin. He was giving away, or he wasn't giving, he was exchanging it. But that's the number one way. People who got it for a penny, they sold their Bitcoin for 10 cents. People who bought it at 10 cents sold their Bitcoin for $1. People who bought Bitcoin for $1 sold it at $10. People who bought it at $10 sold it at $100. People who bought it at $100 sold it at $1,000. On and on and on. Everybody just gets this irresistible urge when they have an investment to sell it when it's way up. Well, in some ways that's good, right? Because it means Bitcoin has distributed itself to now somewhere in the ballpark of 400 million people around the world. If those original OG Bitcoiners had never sold any of their Bitcoin to buy a house or a car, pay off a student loan, whatever it is that they sold it for, or exchange it for 2 Papa John's pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoin as the very first commercial transaction for Bitcoin for something in the real world, other than just, swapping it in and out of, US dollars or something, if nobody had done that, the Bitcoin would all be owned by the OGs. And the reason it's not is because they did with their Bitcoin exactly what you will probably do with your Bitcoin, which is if your Bitcoin makes you 10 times more wealthy, I promise you're going to find it irresistible to convert some of that wealth into things that improve the life of you and your family. And that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. But I often hear people say, wow, I wish I was an OG Bitcoiner, because if I was back then, I would have been super careful not to throw away my private keys. I would have been super careful not to keep my Bitcoin on an exchange. And I never would have sold Bitcoin that I bought for $1 for $100. And let's be honest, you and I absolutely positively would have done that. So let's not pretend that somehow we are so much more geniuses than the OG Bitcoiners that we never would have sold it because we would have known it was going to more than 100,000 a coin. Nobody knew Bitcoin was going to more than 100,000 a coin. I mean, nobody knew that. Nobody could predict the adoption of Bitcoin. So the same is true now. Somewhere, when you buy Bitcoin right now for $105,000 a coin, that means someone somewhere is selling Bitcoin for $105,000 a coin that they probably bought for $10,500 a coin or $10,050 a coin. And they're up 10x. And they're thinking, hey, there's something I want to buy for my family. And so anyway, that is the journey. That is why Bitcoin has beautifully distributed itself all over the world, and it's why it's available for the cheap price of $105,000 right now. Have a great day, everyone.